What we're going to discuss today is troubleshooting ThinApps. Now, I want to clarify something before we get going. Troubleshooting a ThinApp isn't like magic, right? It's not like the little bag of pixie dust and it just works. It's a process, and it entails a couple of things. Reasoning, how you think and how you perceive what you're looking at, and method. And that's really what we're going to discuss. There's no way to say, well, use this tool every time and it'll tell you what's wrong and then you can go fix it. That just literally doesn't exist. And I get a lot of people who have come up to me today, throughout the whole show saying, well, how do I figure this out? And I said, well, you can come to the session and we can talk about it. Because really, in all of my years of doing this, it is how you go about it, right? Because troubleshooting is no different from doing ThinApps to doing what's wrong with my car to, why is my wife pissed at me? I don't know. I can start working that out. I'm usually going to reach the wrong conclusion anyway, right? But anyway, it's literally just about that. It's about thinking in process. So I want everybody to kind of understand that that's what we're going to be talking about. Now, in the course of this, I'm going to show you a particular case study. So we're going to discuss how do we think, what methods do we use for testing to go through our packaging. And then we're going to show an actual problem, and we're going to apply that method to it. So you can see how this all sort of connects itself. Quick disclaimer, I can't be held responsible for telling you any lies or anything like that. If you've got any issues, Aaron's right here in the fifth row on my left. He's the one who handles the complaint department. So I'm not talking about any futures or anything like that. I'll probably bring up some things that are in 4.6 that was just released last week, but outside of that, standard disclaimer. By the way, if this whole AppVert thing doesn't work out, I've got the perfect business, and that is to set up shop right outside the expo and sell those Dr. Scholl inserts for your shoes. Because, dude, my feet were killing me yesterday. So, like I said, we're going to talk about the reality of what we deal with when we troubleshoot. We're going to talk about the logic of troubleshooting. We're going to talk about the scientific method, which is, frankly, what we actually are going to use to do this. And then we're actually going to go through testing procedures and look at an actual issue itself in relation to all that other garbage we're going to talk about. Corporate decided to insert a bunch of slides into my deck. They wanted me to talk about these in particular with end-user computing, which is really cool. So I just did. You're welcome. If you didn't like end-user computing, I don't think you'd be here. Theory. I know this is going to seem a little academic at this point for the next few minutes, but bear with me because it actually is the core to how you're going to troubleshoot your apps. Everybody's heard of Occam's razor, right? And I'm no good with Latin, even though I thought it looked cool, so I put it up there. But what it really comes down to is that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. Now, in itself, that sounds great, right? But there's a fallacy to that logic. And the fallacy is that how do we derive the simplest explanation, right? Everybody's like, oh, it's got to be something easy, but getting there is the journey, right? So it's never as simple as it seems when you ask the question, right? Because we deal with variables. We don't deal with monolithic applications like in the old days. We deal with little complex apps that build on more complex apps that build on more complex apps, right? And it's this chain that's inside your applications that is where you have to be knowledgeable. Now, for those of you who know me and have heard me speak, I have some ThinApp commandments, about 7 of them. But commandment number 1 is know thy app. If you do anything, you have to understand what your application does. You have to understand what components go into your app, prerequisites. You have to understand how your users interface the application. You have to know the app. Now, you don't have to know it to the level of the business owner who actually sits in front of it all day long, but you have to understand its guts, right? I'm not a car guy. I know a car's got an engine. I can probably figure out where the air filter is. I won't find the oil filter. I won't, find anything else. A bunch of wires, it's all kind of foreign to me. It's because there's a great auto body shop next door. But if I had to troubleshoot something, all I would have to understand is what the major components are and then follow a process, right? Because it's universal. But there are a lot of variables. Now, when we start talking about how we think, The other fallacy of logic is what's often referred to as post hoc. You've probably heard people say that in just general conversation, right? Post hoc, which is really, post hoc, ergo, propter hoc, which is after this, therefore, because of this. Causality. If I say something about my wife's dress, she gets mad, right? Cause and effect. Well, the problem is that that's wrong, because it isn't causality, it's correlation. It just so happens that the dress didn't really look good on her, right? And it just so happened that I said something which just so happened meant she got mad. In the case of Mr. Penguin here, he is not an old TV show just because they are both black and white. And when people start troubleshooting, and believe me, in the years I've dealt with this and the calls I've taken, probably from several of you, it's always looking for a cause and effect relationship. That's your first mistake, because we live in the world, again, of variables. So you might be asking yourself, okay, well, if I'm not looking for cause and effect, if my application's doing something, I got to find the root cause of it, then what do I look for? Well, this is where, again, we're going to get a little academic. By the way, are there any philosophy majors who went to college in the house? Nobody? Okay. So I'll use some examples of this. And this is, again, I'm getting kind of weird and academic with it, but believe me, it's how you think and how you perceive the problem with your application that's going to lead you to the right conclusion. Now, we talked about the problem with this piece of logic. There's really three fundamental tenets of logic. And it's really how we look at something, right? The first way we look at something is what we call inductive, which is, oh, gee, all the swans in the pond are white. Therefore, all swans are white. Wrong. Some are black. So there's a flaw in the logic, right? So I can't look and say, this application is causing a problem everywhere. So the problem has got to be something with the application. No, it could be something with the way the users are using it. It could be something environmental. So don't fall prey to the idea that just because it's happening everywhere, that it's related to something again, right? That's sort of a specific statement to a general conclusion. Now, okay, well, let's deal with variables then. How do we look at variables? That's referred to as abductive. And to give you an example, I look at a pool table and the 8 ball's rolling. So I can abduce, which is a terrible word, but I can abduce that the cue ball hit it, right? Well, maybe. Again, what are we lacking? Variables. Maybe it hit it, maybe it bounced off something else, maybe I'm playing pool against my wife and she just like bumps into the table all the time, right? And the ball started moving. We have to account for variables. However, it does help orient ourselves. So when you start looking at your application issue, it's okay to sort of take the variables at hand and say, if all this is happening to all the machines, then I can assume that it's global, right? That the issue is systemic. It isn't particular to any one person. So it'll help us orient to where the particular problem will lie. And then, of course, the last one, which everybody's familiar with, is deduction, right? I can deduce that if, if bachelors are single males and this guy is a bachelor, then he's obviously male, right? We have to, at some point, look at the variables, formulate a question, and then test to validate whether our question is accurate or not. So the logic of how you think, believe it or not, is what's going to help you get there. And I know it sounds kind of weird to talk about it on a troubleshooting thing, but when I take calls, what I get is, I click on it and the dialog pops up and then it goes away. So there's something wrong with the application. I'm like, okay, so what what else is going on? They're like, what do you mean what else is going on? It doesn't work. I'm like, no, what else is going on? They don't understand the process of gathering information. And that's because they are not thinking about method. Now, we all went to school. At some point, somewhere in our education, we learned about the scientific method, right? And I'm just going to reiterate it because, believe it or not, this is what I use. Every time, in fact, yesterday's session, a gentleman came up to me in the booth with his laptop open, right? What a great way to start a conversation. Hi, my name is so-and-so. I got this problem with this application here. See what it's doing? It's all messed up. So I took it upon myself to use it as a case study to work his problem, because he came to the session that afternoon, by the way, we solved the issue, but to use this method as a way to help teach him how to avoid talking to me. Which, when you really look at the subtext of all this, it's really to keep you from calling me, right? But no, it's teach you to fish. Now, when we talk about method, we talk about probably the most important step, which is right at the beginning, which is observation and asking questions. When your user says, I'm having a problem with an app, or you're packaging and you have a problem with the app, you have got to start asking questions. What am I running on? How am I doing this? What other variables are in play? What are those? What are the impact of those? Is it something that I could be doing? You just have to gather information. In the case of the guy yesterday, his particular issue was that he had tested on a couple of different platforms. He had gotten some inconsistent results. He wasn't sure if the problem was with the app or with his workstation. He wasn't quite sure on how it talked to the database backend. So we started asking questions, and you've got to do that. More importantly, you've also got to interview and talk to the users of the app as well, because sometimes you'll find issues after you've deployed. Because, again, we don't know the application. Not like they do, right? It could be something buried into the 5th level of some workflow. So you've got to ask questions. Now, once you've asked those questions, you have to research and do data collection. Now, when we go into the case study, we're going to talk about some of the tools on how to do that and how you interpret that information. And then, of course, we have to construct a hypothesis. State my problem, and what would I assume would happen if I did X? And then we have to test that. And then based on the results of that test, I'll either get a positive or negative. It'll probably uncover more information, as you'll see in our sample, which will lead me to ask another question, and I start the whole thing over again. Now, a lot of you may think this is really laborious. I don't want to do this. This is going to take me forever. Well, troubleshooting thin apps is an art more than a science. The science is what you follow. But as you get more stick time in troubleshooting and working with the product, the more adept you're going to be at sort of eliminating things and getting to your answers a lot quicker. And of course, analysis of that data to determine what you need to do in order to take the next step is what we'll also talk about. And then, of course, did it work? Did it not work? If it did, great. If not, go back. Now, bear in mind, about 80% of the applications in my experience work. But I don't care about those. Nobody calls me about those. They call me about the 20%. Now, out of the 20%, I would say about 15% of them are solvable. The remaining 5% are going to be issues associated with our code, something we have to fix. So your goal should always be very simple. If I have a problem, I have to work the steps to determine one of two things. Either there's a possibility of me solving it, or this is really something that ThinApp's going to have to work on in their code to resolve the issue. And if you go through a very easy method of testing and validation, you'll quickly determine that, right? And when you decide to say, nope, this is a problem with VMware, I got to open a support ticket so it can get to a developer, you're going to be able to supply us all with this information, which, as Aaron will sit back there and readily nod his head about, makes his life and his developer's life a whole hell of a lot easier. Because if they don't have to come back to you constantly over the days and the weeks, getting more information, and you can supply it all, quicker we're going to get to resolution. So we've talked about how we think. We've talked about the different ways that we can think wrong and how we can utilize that. And we've also talked about method. So let's take this and now put it within the context of ThinApp. Now, what I'm about to talk about and show you is the way I do things. It may not be the way you want to do it. Certainly the other desktops or ThinApp specialists on my team, they all do it a little different. But I'm going to show you my method simply because I do this day in and day out, and it works. And it works for me. So you can take from that what you'd like. First off, you've got to have a testing procedure. Period. Everybody I talk to, and I mean almost, all right, maybe 2 people didn't or do have a procedure, but almost everybody else. I packaged it, I ran it on a machine, it didn't work. Okay, you went from A to Z. There's a lot of things in the middle there that you didn't even bother to look at, right? So the variables are all on the table. And testing is about the elimination of variables. So we have to have a good testing methodology. And that's actually how I act when I get on the phone. I get very disturbed. So here's my testing procedure. The first test that I do is what I call a dirty test. Now, we all use, or hopefully we all use, a capture and build environment. That's a VM, I would hope, right? Because I'm sure we all have some VMware vSphere, Workstation Fusion in our companies. Anybody here who's just pure ThinApp? They don't have any other? Yeah, that's what I thought. One day someone's going to go, me. So the dirty test is very simple. I take that capture and build environment, I install and capture my application, I build it on that environment, and then I immediately turn around and just test the exe. The app is still locally installed because I just put it in, I just built, I just test. Dirty test. Now why do I do that? Because if the application fails at this point, with even it being local, which means that anything that I might have missed or may not have been registered or accounted for is on the machine, if it fails at this point, the likelihood is that I've got a code problem. ThinApp, VMware, have a code problem, something fundamental that we're having an issue with. And it should raise a little red flag of, okay, maybe I'm going to need to do maybe one or two little tests, but then I'm going to probably call VMware. Now, the dirty test is easy, right? Because you're already there. The second test is the one most commonly overlooked, and I call it the washed test. I'm on the same machine. I simply open add remove programs, and I start uninstalling the components one at a time that show up there. I uninstall one component, I go and run the exe. What happens? I install another, go run the exe. What happens? What am I doing? I'm eliminating variables one at a time, and I'm testing my app. Because I know if I get down to maybe the fourth thing that it installed, and I uninstall it from add remove, and I go test my app, and my app fails, guess what? There's a connection, a relationship, something I can focus on. Now, we all know that doing add remove isn't a clean uninstallation, right? There's no such thing as a clean uninstallation unless you actually have a clean machine, therefore the clean test. I can take that snapshot of that clean environment. Once I've done my wash test, if everything pans out and I'm able to launch my application, it still works, then I can guarantee a clean environment simply by snapshotting back and running the app again. Now, during the wash test, obviously you were able to see the relationship between I uninstalled a component, the app worked, or I uninstalled and the app failed. Then I know what to go look at. But in the clean test, what you're just doing is making sure that, okay, it's really uninstalled because I reverted back to a clean environment. Now, if the application fails at that point, what does that tell us? It tells us that there was literally something in the host that was resident, whether the app did it, whether the OS did it, but when I went to a clean environment and got rid of anything I did during my install, it vanished. So I can say that it's probably more related to something in the operating system than it is inside the application. And then, of course, there's the production test. And that's usually where people go to. They go straight to a production test, right? Well, the problem with a production test is that if you pass the clean, run the app, everything works as you expect it to, and you put it in a production environment and it fails, what do you think the problem is? It's environmental. Yeah. And when it's environmental, it could be anything, right? It could be security. It could be the network. Because if you're running the apps across the network, I've seen it where the switching fabric's doing stateful packet inspection and it was screwing up the ability of the app to launch, right? Because it was filtering things out. But it's most likely an environmental problem. And at that point, you can say, okay, well, now I just need to simply eliminate the environmental things in order to determine what the possibility of that is. So this is my testing procedure. Whenever somebody calls me, this is what I go through. In fact, I did it last night working on an application. I did it this morning twice to help somebody solve an app. In fact, the gentleman yesterday who was in my session who had his problem, that's exactly what we did as well. So how many do procedures like this? How many, when you package an application, you're, ba-boom, 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 something like this? Anybody? Few people? Yeah? So if the most of you aren't doing this, and you're running into problems, I would like to give you a percentage of how well this will help clarify stuff for you, but if you actually go back and you do this, almost 3/4 of the issues you get, you'll fix. And I've done this with an organization that had 2,000 apps, who was starting off with just a handful. I taught them this process because the first few they tried, problem, right? I taught them how to do it. They started doing it after that. They've never called me since. What's that? They quit using ThinApp. I never thought about that. No, they actually came back and bought more. So they were using it. I don't know what for, but they were on their own, right? It's almost like they didn't care about me anymore. I actually called the guy one time just to check in, and I'm like, what's the matter, man? I'm piss you off or something? He's like, why are you so insecure? So let's look at a case study. We're going to take what we learned about thinking, logic, method, and process, and we're going to apply it to an actual issue that I've worked. Now, again, for full disclosure, this particular problem and why it occurred, we're able to fix, but we were also able to take this and put it into our code so that the problem wouldn't occur again, because it was sort of consistent. We were seeing it all the time. So even for ThinApp, when we see issues and we're able to remediate those, if we see them over and over again, we can sometimes, even for ourselves, draw a relationship back to our code, and we can fix something so that it just doesn't happen to you again. So in this particular example, it was very common. We also fixed it, even though users were able to as well. So the first thing we're going to do in our study is we're going to gather information about this app. So this is Excel 2003 with a Lawson plugin. Anybody use Lawson? A couple of people? Yeah? Got the plugin for Excel, right? The little drill downs and stuff like that. This particular app puts in a bunch of macros, has a little drop-down menu with like 3 options on it, right? Logs into a server, and you got these 3 Excel macros. Well, the problem is that out of the 3, we were getting some inconsistent results. Number 1, it put a little check mark by it if it was selected, but it wasn't consistent. Sometimes it was checked, sometimes it wasn't. The other button was supposed to open a dialog. It didn't, and the third one just flat out didn't do anything. And of course, I had gathered a bunch of error logs and stuff like that, just that the user had to start this whole process. So the first thing I wanted to do was state the problem. Well, the problem is that the Excel plugin showed up. I was able to log into the server as per the way that it's supposed to operate, but these things didn't work. I clearly stated the problem. It doesn't work. It wasn't that I couldn't log in. You have to be very specific, right? Because you're going to get more information as you go along. So if you don't state the proper problem, then what you do is never going to lead you to the proper conclusion. So as you can see here, you can kind of see the drop-down dialog. This is after you get logged in. So my hypothesis was simple. The application works natively by doing this, but it doesn't work as a ThinApp, yet everything shows up based on what I stated in the problem. So obviously, I think I'm missing something. That's my hypothesis. Now, it could be right, it could be wrong. You may ask questions, get positives, get negatives, but it may formulate more questions in your mind. So just, don't think you've got to come up with the penultimate, it's this. And if I test that and it works, it's fixed. You may go through this several times. But this was my first question was, it's missing something. So what do I got to do? I got to test that. So we'll use our process. Let's do a dirty test. Did a dirty test of the application with it locally installed. Guess what? The ThinApp worked. Great. Passed the dirty test. Let's start uninstalling the components. The wash test, the one that most people overlook. Well, guess what happens? The ThinApp doesn't work. And I start getting the same problems. Now, little key point here that I didn't put in the slide. During a wash test, you may start getting issues that are different from the original issue that brought you to try to figure out what was going on. So pay attention to the symptoms. Because if the symptoms change, the problem could be rooted someplace else. And I know it sounds like a really bad episode of House, but it's never lupus, right? It's the whole House thing. Yeah, there's no answer. So you always want to pay attention to the symptom because, you may start with a sniffle and you end up with a, sore toe. So in this particular case, I got to the wash test and I failed. The other tests don't mean anything now. I don't even need to bother with it. So I confirmed my hypothesis. Yay. It's missing something. Well, it doesn't solve it, right? But based on the testing and the results and what I saw, I was able to get a consistent problem now at a particular point in the process. So that helps me narrow down my thinking, narrow down where to look. I know what I need to go start looking to gather information around so that I can actually resolve this. Now, when I started teaching this a while ago, I would always ask the question, did that help? I asked the question, I did a test, I got a positive. Did it help? And it was mixed, right? Yeah, no, don't know what I just did. Again, remember, you're going to be going through this over and over again. So what's our next step? We go back up to the top of that tree. Let's gather more information. So I talked to the user and I said, all right, really, what is this thing? Know thy app. Oh, it's a bunch of XLA files. They're in the Excel start folder. Lawson uses this DLL located in a certain folder itself in order to activate and interface with the server component and stuff. And I was like, all right, well, really there's some interactions going on. So for me, I use two tools. Even though you can use any number of tools that you want, I really want to talk about the two I like. I use Process Explorer, which used to be a System Internals tool, right? You can download it from Microsoft. And I use our Log Monitor. Now, Process Explorer is great. I can watch processes. I can see the DLLs they load. I can see when things start, stop. I can see how much memory, how much CPU you're using. I can't tell you how many times I had a user say, my application's running really slow. And when I opened up the application and I was using Process Explorer, I could see some child process spinning the processor at like 100%. Yet the other parts of the application were running normally. So it wasn't the app was bad, it was this one little thing, right? So that's why Process Explorer is so good. Log Monitor, our utility, who's used Log Monitor? Real quick. All right, out of the people who used it, who understood it? Yeah, that's what I thought. Well, shut up, Aaron. Aaron understands it. No, you don't. So our Log Monitor was really written for our guys, right? It records every single API call being made, and there's a lot of those, and the logs can get to hundreds of thousands of lines, right? I'm actually going to show you during this sample what sections to look at and how to use Log Monitor to your benefit. Because frankly, I've learned a lot as far as the coding aspect, but I couldn't tell you what I'm looking at half the time in those things anyway. Somebody says, what's this say? I'm like, I don't know. So let's launch Process Explorer, and let's do a comparison. I need more information, right? I asked the user about how the app worked. He kind of explained it. I said, well, I need to go watch it. I need to just physically see what's going on. So I used a local copy, local installation, and then I used my ThinApp. And what I do is I turn it on so that I can highlight the process and I can look at the DLLs that are being loaded. Because remember, a lot of application issues are related to the DLLs that they load and the conflicts or lack thereof, stuff like that. And I just did a quick little snapshot, right? Just ran it and took a look just to see what popped up, what was different. Yeah? No, I did this on the dirty machine. So you can kind of see the dialogue here over on that side, the login thing, really. So all I did is I just launched the applications and watched them. Now, again, I don't know how this application was written. I barely know what it does. I have base information, but I don't need to know. I just need to look for the obvious, right? So I'm sort of doing that induction thing. All the swans in the lake are white, right? I'm looking for the black one swimming around. So I ran Process Explorer, and I noticed something. I noticed that on the local version, there were a couple of things being loaded that weren't being loaded in my ThinApp one. Well, that's weird, maybe. I don't know at this point, but I'm observing a difference, right? And it was this riched 32 DLL and this riched 32 OCX file. All right, I don't know what that means yet, but it's a difference, so I write that down. So I say, I wonder what could possibly be going on with that. So where else can I go get more information? Well, this is where Log Monitor comes in. Log Monitor not only records every single API call being made by your application to itself, to the other processes, to other DLLs, but it also has this great little section toward the bottom. It's called Modules Loaded. And the easiest way to get there in the log when you generate a log file is just to do a search to Modules Loaded, and it'll take you right there so you don't have to scroll through everything. And inside Modules Loaded section, it tells me some very specific things. It tells me what DLLs and control libraries like OCX files have been loaded. And you can tell that if it says memory mapped anon, that's been loaded by ThinApp. It's in the package, we loaded it into memory. If it says system loaded, that means it's resident on the operating system, and it was loaded from there. Now, why is that important? That's because we run in the bubble, right? Everything's inside that bubble. So if I load something in that bubble, is it visible from the OS? No. If it's loaded by the system, is it visible from the bubble to the OS? Yeah, sure, right? Because I can see back through the bubble onto the operating system, but not the other way. So as I was looking through this thing, and I was looking for those two things I saw from Process Explorer, I noticed that the OCX file was showing up as memory mapped to none, loaded by us. So I can deduce from that it must be in my package. But I didn't see the DLL. Okay, again, I don't know why these have any bearing on the application, but again, I noticed a difference and I started to gather more information. So I know that those two files were showing up locally, but not in mine. And I know that the OCX is showing up being loaded by us. So I go over to my project folder and I go to the System32 to see if it's there, just to confirm. Yep, sure enough, it's there. But the DLL isn't. Okay. Starting to formulate a question in your head, aren't you? Two things are missing. One's being loaded by us, it's in the project, but the other isn't being loaded by us. It's not in the project, and it's missing. Okay, I've got a lot of information, so what's my hypothesis? I think my hypothesis is that if I put the RichEd32 DLL into the project and we load it to memory from within the bubble, the application will see it and use it. Right? Makes total sense. I don't know if this is going to solve the problem, but again, you don't have to totally understand the intricacies of your applications to reach this point. You simply have to follow a method and a process and gather your information. So this is what I did. I said, if I put this into the project and I rebuild and I retest, this application should work, not knowing if it really will. So that's exactly what I did. So I go back and I test my hypothesis. I do my dirty, my washed, and so forth. And guess what happened? I did the dirty, got the same result. It worked because it was local. I uninstalled the local, I did the wash. Guess what? It worked. Holy cow, I just got past a milestone. I did the clean and I did production, and it consistently worked in all four. I confirmed the hypothesis. I was able to determine through simple observation there was something missing. I was able to go gather information using some simple tools like Process Explorer and interpreting some of that information with Log Monitor. And then I was able to formulate another hypothesis, go test that hypothesis, and I got a positive result. And that's all I had to do. Now, granted, I did this over the course of a couple of days, simply because I had other things going on. But you can see that it does not take a rocket scientist to troubleshoot. It just takes consistent procedures and methods. Now, does anybody have any questions on this case study and how I got here? Yeah.
Why did the capture exclude the 1032
I have no idea. I have no idea. You know, but you have a good question. He asked, why did the capture exclude the RichEd32 DLL? I don't know. Commandment number 2, we expose bad programming. You know, if I have an application that fails and I fix it, I basically chalk it up to that guy did something wrong when he wrote the darn thing, right? Or how they did the installer, because I had to fix it. Question? Yeah. No. His question was that I copied the DLL into the project or I redid the capture. No, I copied the DLL. Because remember, when we have our project folder, we don't actually have to recapture to add or change anything in the project. So if it's something as simple as a file, I can just dump it in there and rebuild. And it's going to have it in there. Now, keep in mind with certain DLLs, sometimes there's registrations that go with those. So as Peter, one of the desktop specialists who's going to be doing this in Copenhagen, he loves to use SB merge. So what he does is if he sees a difference or a problem, he'll launch the app from a command line, and he'll go in there and he'll dump it in that way because he gets a quicker result. But that's his preferred methodology. And then if it works, he just runs SB merge because it also will capture things like if he has to register the DLL. In this particular case, I just dumped it in there because the OCX, because again, I just went on Google, right? What the heck does this thing do? The OCX is what it was actually calling the DLL. And I figured if that's in the project, I put the DLL in there, I should be right as rain. Yeah. How did I recompile? I just ran build. Just ran build.bat. Yeah. Yeah, again, you don't have to go through the capture. Now, a guy brought up a very interesting point yesterday. He was one of the ones that said that he did the kind of testing that I do, the procedures. But what he did is right before he did the post scan, he snapshots the workstation. That way, if he ever has to go back and do something, he reverts back to that snapshot, and he's literally right there before the post scan. Yeah, that's right. I don't do that. So, but then again, I do things like kind of weird sometimes. Again, you're going to do it the way that makes sense for you, right? And he said, no, I always snapshot that. And he says, the reason I do that is I keep it. He's like, because sometimes, again, like I mentioned, when you deploy that application into the field, and some user is in a workflow and he gets 5 levels down and he runs into a problem and you have to troubleshoot it, he's like, it's easier for me to go right back to that snapshot at that point and start working it again from there, rather than trying to take the project and redo everything. So he likes to go right back to that environment. And that made a lot of sense to me. And if VMware will buy me a huge terabyte, 10 terabyte drive thing to store all of it, then I'll do it. I don't have enough space on my drive. Anybody have any other questions about this particular case study here, as far as what we did? Yeah? Oh, what? Yeah, we fixed it. I think Jonathan said we fixed this in 404. I think it was like 2 versions back. Yeah, so this particular problem doesn't exist anymore, even if you have it. So you don't have to do it. We actually fixed it in our code. And again, sometimes we can do that. But I do want to point out, let's check the time here. I do want to point out that when this guy was testing this application on his own before he called me, the first thing he did was after he built it, he went and ran it on a machine in his environment, and it worked. Why do you think it worked? Exactly. He got a false positive. He ran it on 3 other machines in this one group. Totally worked. He thought he was good to go. He goes to production. As soon as it hits a machine that never had this thing put on it, it failed. And then all hell broke loose, right? That's why it's so important to follow that process. Because if you skip right to a production environment, you may run into the problem later on. Also, a question was brought up in yesterday's session about, well, what happens if I change the environment? Patching. So I kind of wanted to address that too. Most applications themselves, from Patch Tuesday perspective, right, the Microsoft patching to our operating systems, aren't technically affected by that, right? Because we're talking about OS patches, security patches, things like that. Obviously, there may be patches for Windows, .NET, and whatnot that come in that. But for the most part, the applications really don't have anything to do with it. I mean, I seriously doubt Adobe Acrobat is affected by Microsoft Patch Tuesday. Now, obviously, they put out their patches. So one of the questions I was asked is, what do we do to handle patching for these ThinApps? And what happens if I load a patch onto the OS versus the application and vice versa? So rule of thumb is that if an application has everything it needs in its bubble, right, all of its prerequisites, the likelihood that Patch Tuesday for the OS is going to adversely affect your ThinApp is low. Simply because if you do an update to .NET on the workstation and yet .NET 1.1 was in your package, that's what's going to get used. Okay? So very low risk. However, if you do have things that are separated out like that, you have a much higher risk, right? And it's not because of ThinApp, it's because of your app itself. Know thy app. If you have a hard-coded application that requires a hard-coded version of something, like an Adobe Reader 8, and then you update all your machines to Adobe 9, guess what's going to happen? Your app's going to scream at you. So it's very important when you start the process of capturing that you also look at what's required and decide, should I put it in the package or should I just leave it out on my workstations? Which led to the question that he had specifically, which is his base image has a lot of stuff in it because he doesn't capture on what I call a clean machine. He captures on the core image that everybody in his company gets. So he already knows they're all going to have these prereqs. But his issue is that those change, right? Because that's managed separately. Because he put the application ownership back to the business unit. I'm going to teach you to ThinApp. You're going to ThinApp your app. You're going to manage that. You're just going to give me the XE and I'll deploy. And I'll take care of my workstation. And we start to see that more and more. So as a ThinApp packager, you have to consider, well, maybe I ought to put all the stuff I really need in here, right? Because these guys aren't going to be conscious of that effort. And if they go and update something, they could break my app. So patching, I basically approach it as, if I own the app, I put everything in it. I don't rely on the workstation. That way, if the workstation changes, like you're going from physical to VDI, you're going, how many are doing Win 7 migrations, for instance? Exactly. Things in the environment change, but yet our apps probably want more consistency than that. So that's why I package up like that. Did anybody have a question on another patch or how to, yeah?
So
Right. So for those who didn't hear his question, he's like, if I have a clean machine and I'm doing my testing there and I go to production, is it possible that there could be something that was on the clean that isn't on production? Definition of clean is where this becomes important. Yeah, for me, clean is XPSP2 without a single patch loaded. I'm talking raw. And the reason I do that is that I want my application to scream at me if it's missing something, because I can't tell you how many weeks I've spent troubleshooting an app that it turned out that it was a very specific version of the C++ runtime library that was necessary. And the machine I was testing on, didn't account for that. And I had no clue that the app needed it until I ran it on my uber clean machine and it said, no, I need this. I'm like, if I'd have known that 2 weeks ago, I could have saved myself a lot of trouble. So that's why I capture on something like that. But your point is valid. It isn't that something will be missing, because the likelihood is that it won't be if you're using a proper clean environment. The likelihood is that you take, right, it's different out here, and you didn't capture something you needed. So, maybe your machine had .NET 1.1 on it, or it had some old VC++ library, right? And you go out here and you're on Win7 and it's V9 versus V8. So things like that. Yeah. For me, it's Windows XP SP2, no patches, Windows Installer 3.1, and the VM tools. That's my capture machine. Yeah, the QA guys do. Oh, from the capture process, yeah. Aaron was saying when you do setup capture, you remember there's a snapshot INI file? Has anybody ever looked at that? Nobody? Really? A couple people? So when you look in the folder structure for where setup capture is, there's a snapshot INI. That's the exclusion file. That's what we won't capture during snapshotting. And it's folders and registry values. And one of the things we don't capture is the VM tools, as Aaron was pointing out. So even if it's there, we're not going to pick up anything that happens to the VM tools. But you can go in there and set exclusions, right? So here's another troubleshooting thing. How many of you have to capture on a production image? Because you have to have antivirus on it and stuff like that. You just can't have some willy-nilly clean machine sitting off in the ether. Anybody? A couple of folks? You can go in a snapshot INI, you can set your own exclusions. Don't capture this folder. Don't capture these file types. That way you can work on a machine that may have some stuff on it, knowing it's not going to be in your project. So keep that in mind. Any other questions on capture and build and clean? Yeah. I include, so it's Windows XP SP2, Windows Installer 3.1, and the VM tools. And the reason I put the Windows Installer 3.1 on there is because obviously I need to have something on there to do handle MSI installations. But more importantly, it also, I don't think VM tools does anymore, but it puts the Visual C++ V8 libraries, which are a bunch of Windows side-by-side library files, onto the workstation. And that's typically on any Windows machine you get. But when you do a really clean one like that, you don't get them. So that's why I do it. And for those of you who have any stick time troubleshooting, you realize that that's a problem, especially when you start looking at Win7, because it's all V9. It's there's also instances where you won't get any of the V8s and your application will need it. So keep that in mind. All right, so for the last 15 minutes, what I wanted to do is basically open the floor for anybody who wanted to discuss any of their app issues or had any general questions, because I just wanted to make a Q&A. It's right here. Right. So his question was that when he was troubleshooting issues, he would sometimes try to go put the file into the sandbox and then run the app to see if it would work. The reason you can't do that is that the VOS, the ThinApp code in the exe, is controlling the sandbox. And if you go into the virtual registry under HKey, I think it's current user or local machine, I forget. Anyway, if you go underneath that and you go down, you'll find a subkey called FS. And underneath that FS subkey, you will see where folders and files are being created and tracked. And that is a registry section our code uses to track what's in the sandbox. So you can put anything you want into the sandbox. We'll never see it because we didn't make a marker for it. No. No. So you cannot affect an application by putting something in the sandbox and then running it again. It will not see it because we didn't put a tag for it.
Any rule of thumb with packaging .NET framework?
.NET framework?
Lessons learned from .NET frameworks?
It's simple. Best practices. Commandment number 7, best practices are in the eye of the beholder. A lot of people will capture their .NET framework separately, and they'll use AppLink. That way they can control what version goes to what. But capturing it, it's a no-brainer. I don't have any issues with it. Windows 7 competitive? That's a whole topic. We'll talk about that here in a second. Hey, let me take him back here. So your application is screaming at you that it has to
It hasn't been able to contact the server in 30 days, and it's based on utilization. So I was basically monitoring the state expiring and like that. They're loading from the exact same server.
So it's actually, so your application talks to a database, some server back in? Is it the app doing it, or you think this is ThinApp? Oh, okay. Right, and it's not doing it. So what you need to do is you need to figure out what does the application do to check the server? How does it call the server, right? Right, how does the application in the ThinApp talk to the server? And the reason I say that is that some applications will look for, ThinApp doesn't have any restriction or code restrictions. Oh, AppSync. Oh, AppSync. Oh, okay, yeah. Well, in that case, the only reason that it would come back and say it couldn't contact the server is, number one, you told it to check periodically, right? And set the expiration. Number two, it's trying to check and it can't reach it. So if it's yeah, but what are you using? What is the path to check for the exe? Itself? You can't check itself. It's got to check someplace else. Yeah, you would use our .1 side-by-side updating to update that application. Because you can't check the app itself, because what the VOS does is it actually loads the hash, and it does a hash comparison. So if it's trying to load the hash of itself, it's like trying to look like in a dry balls. Yeah, AppSync is really built for updating applications against a remote target, right? HTTP, HTTPS, or some file share. If you're trying to update an application that sits on a network itself, you can use what we call our side-by-side updating. And that is simply, I create a new ThinApp, and I give it the same name, except I change the extension to .1 or .2 or .3, and I just place it right next to it. And when somebody launches the original exe, it actually runs the .1. Yeah, you don't use you would only use that for something you're doing there, not AppSync, because AppSync's really for Joe's like at home, and he's got to update his application remotely. You had a question?
Any tricks to get past application that needs admin rights without giving the users?
It's going to depend on the kind of admin rights we're talking about. In the most part, within the bubble, the user has all the rights in the world he needs, right? Even though the user context may be completely restricted, in the virtual file system, he's full control. But when it comes to administration rights, if you're talking about the application accessing something on the machine, we actually are going to be bound by the user context. So if the user is a limited restricted user and the app is trying to act something that he doesn't have rights to do, he's not going to be able to do it. And we do that specifically to maintain security compliance. So there's no way to circumvent that. Which goes to commandment number 3, which is ethics doesn't ship with the code. Just because I can help you break stuff doesn't mean you should. But no, we won't circumvent user security in that respect. So if there's a folder, and I've seen this before, right, where a person's trying to access a folder or something like that, and he thinks, well, if I use a ThinApp to do it, I'll be able to access it because he's got all the rights. It's like, no, it doesn't translate. Right. It's got to be the same name with a number extension. No, I mean, so if I had, let's say, word.exe, and I have a new version, I make it word.1. When anybody launches word.exe, it actually launches the word.1 file. And if I create another one, I call it word.2. If anybody launches the exe, they launch the word.2. No. It's literally just .1, right? And it can be either directly next to it, or you could actually specify what we call upgrade path equals and tell it where to look. So this actually can be someplace else. So yeah, and the nice thing about doing that, that's a live update, right? So if you have a terminal server environment or a VDI environment and you're sharing on a network share and you want to update the app, you can actually use the .1 file put right next to it. And you don't have to knock anybody out of the primary XE to update the application. When they log off and log back into the XE, they'll get the new one. It's in the package INI. It's upgrade path equals. Yeah. Default is directly next to it.
The side-by-side process explorer, you're building the package with a command line interface to get into the bubble.
Actually,
Launching process explorer.
No. I'm running Process Explorer from the outside.
Oh, you're running from the
Absolutely. I run it from the outside because it'll show you everything.
So what troubleshooting do you do from within the bubble? Where you're going to do a command line and actually go in and run in the bubble? Anything?
Well, let me give you the example of the guy's problem yesterday. So, I was about to say, that's not my phone. What the hell was that? That's okay. I'll play my ringtone for you here in a second, but because it actually went off in a thing yesterday. It was sort of embarrassing. But no, I actually I do very little in the bubble, all right? Because usually that's not where the problem is. So in my experience, I just never go there. The guy's problem yesterday is that he was launching the application and it was saying, I can't connect to the SQL server. I can't find the mp.ini file in weird code, path, weird code, right? So I deciphered that as I can't find the INI file. And he's like, well, the INI file is in the package. Because he searched the package and there it was, right? C program files, mp.ini. I said, well, let's go look at your entry point then. How is the application launching? And it was launching mp.exe against c:documents and settings / all users / folder, whatever. It was looking for the INI in the wrong place. Because the way the application was installed and the shortcut created is that it was for the user, right? But we didn't capture that. So he actually just had to change the entry point to point to where it really was, and it all worked. Well, what happens is when we actually set the entry points, when you do the setup capture and you choose your entry points, we look at a variety of locations. We look at things like in the start menu. We look at the XEs that are laid on there. That's why sometimes you get like 800, things to choose from, right? Just do clear all. In fact, I don't even mess with it. I just clear all and I go write my own in the INI. But sometimes what you'll do is you'll get entry points that were put on the desktop. And that's what he did. He chose that one, not thinking that it was going to be specific for the user account he captured with. So therefore, the pathing was wrong. So we changed that and boop, it worked.
Back to the side-by-side updating, do you see any issues with sandbox corruption caused by side-by-side updating?
Sandbox corruption caused by side-by-side updating, yes. And the reason is that, and this is another best practice. For me, if it's a minor upgrade of an application, I'll keep the same sandbox name, right? So if I'm doing a service pack, hot fix, something like that, I'll leave the sandbox the same. If I do a major application upgrade, i.e. I go from 4 to 5, I create a new sandbox. So when I give that application to the user, he gets a new sandbox. Because even though he may have to reconfigure settings and stuff, if you give somebody Office 2003 today and then you give them 2010 tomorrow, the likelihood is they're going to have to go reconfigure their interface, right? So their perception is, I already do that anyway, so it's not a big deal to give them a new sandbox. And I do that for that reason, is that you can get corruption between major versions.
When you've seen it with Microsoft Access 2003, we had 4 different versions of there, and we got to the point where it ended up corrupting everybody's sandboxes, so we had to take all the previous versions down, rename the latest one, and then delete all their sandboxes and clean that out.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it depends if typically in something like Access and whatnot, you could blow the sandbox away upon exit, right? Yeah, and it does it every time, right? So it depends on whether or not you care about, personality for the user setting, if he configures the toolbar his way. Or if you don't care about that, I would just blow the sandbox away.
Well, as best practice, we generally do that, but for Office applications, sometimes there's
nicknames and things like that. Yeah, so Office is really an exception to the rule because of all the things. 5 minutes? Okay. Yeah, I mean, for the most part, if you've already gotten caught in the trap of going from, let's say, 03 to 07 to 010 and you've kept the same sandbox, then yeah, it's kind of a dirty thing to kind of go give them a new one and whatnot, but that's probably what you're going to have to do. Really? Like service pack hotfix and stuff?
Not even service packs, like, like I think one of the times, the latest one, we added BSN.
Really? Yeah. Then that tells me if you're getting sandbox corruption, something else is happening.
Yeah, but it happens for everybody, so clear out their sandbox.
Ah, yeah, but don't, all the swans are white.
I don't know, it just, I was wondering if you'd seen that.
I had not seen that, but what it starts raising questions in my head is environmental. Because what you're doing and the symptom you're getting doesn't sound like a one-to-one relationship. So, yeah.
We see issues, we need folder redirection instead of using data disks.
Right.
Sandboxes off on the file share.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have, as the architect, have multiple view desktops that I'm in.
Yeah.
And I've blocked my sandbox where I had to bounce the server. And is that just because I'm the oddball hitting from multiple view desktops at the same time, that same sandbox with the same application?
Using UDD?
I mean, is it
Using the UDD? The user data disk?
folder redirection?
Folder redirection?
Yeah, it's a folder redirection, so the sandbox ends
We'll
up
talk
on the
offline.
file server.
We'll talk offline.
Okay.
I'm sure Aaron didn't hear the question, but he'll cringe. Using folder redirection to UNC? Yeah. Yeah. We'll talk specifically. There's some issues with the UNC. Yeah, we'll talk about that. There's some issues with UNC redirection stuff. Yeah. Specifically around %app data %, by the way. So now, if you're using something like Liquidware Labs Profile Unity and stuff like that, now I did come across this recently for a big VDI customer that was using Profile Unity. The way that they were laying the applications on and then registering them and then taking that with the profile, when they put the profile back down on another desktop within the floating pool, they were getting ThinReg problems. And that's because the location of all that stuff was changing dynamically with the profile. So the key was in Profile Unity to exclude the thinstall/unregister folder, which is where we put all the little VB scripts and so forth when you do ThinReg, to exclude that in the profile. So when you lay it down there, essentially you're just running ThinReg clean on top of it every single time. And keep in mind, if you're doing that, you don't need to use /r, because /r has been known to kind of slow things up a little bit.
You ever run into people working with stream apps and they're just slow because
Oh, yeah.
they're slow links, but just slow because of other reasons?
Yeah. Oh, all the time. I've got some guys with 10 gig apps that run great from a network, and I got some guys with 200 meg apps that suck. For me, I don't like running ThinApps streaming unless I'm streaming to a hosted environment, VDI, terminal servers. Simply because that last golden mile link down to the workstation probably sucks. Not to mention if you actually look at an application, right? So you can open up Task Manager, go to the network thing, go to add columns, and you can add bytes received, and then launch your ThinApp, and you can actually see how many bytes come down, because then you can actually baseline your application. I mean, it's kind of, ghetto way of doing it, but you can actually launch your app and see exactly how much gets loaded to get your application going. So, I had a guy who had the same problem, right? It was a 400 meg app. He didn't think it was any big deal because he had larger ones streaming. But it was actually bringing 400 meg down upon launch because there was a flat file DB in there. And it was writing to the sandbox, which was local. So by doing that, I was able to see exactly how much data was coming across, and that was his performance issue. Well, but like the other one I mentioned earlier was stateful packet inspection. That was just chopping up the packets and causing all sorts of performance hits. So again, that's why in a hosted environment, you're probably on a backplane that's number one, fast, number two, better controlled as far as its openness, between the two systems. So I don't like doing it down to the workstation. All right. Any other last questions? I'll be hanging out. No? Thanks, guys.